the title I threw together here was A Brief History of Scenario-Based Assessment and Other Innovations Stemming from the Reading for Understanding Initiative. And I was asked to talk about the Reading for Understanding Initiative. But I realized as I was doing this that, that's sort of the middle of the story. It's like in Star Wars, you started in the middle, but then you need the prequels to understand how you got there. So that's what I decided would be the best idea to do. So we will get to Reading for Understanding at some point in this talk. But first, all the slides are available, and throughout I'm sort of punctuating it with publications that talk about some of the results and that we've accomplished with these points. But first, we're going to go back in time.
Star Wars.
And I went way back. I was looking through all my presentations, and I realized that in the talk I gave before I moved to ETS, I had actually used this title and realized as I walked down, I believe, the street out here that it has a resonance with the folks here at Oxford. So, and then I found this, and I'm going to read it out loud because almost all the talks I enjoy, I have a quote from Invisible Cities, Italo Calvino. And this one said, Marco Polo, it describes a bridge to Kublai Khan, stone by stone. But which is the stone that supports the bridge? Kublai Khan asks. It's a fictional story. The bridge is not supported by one stone or another, Marco answers, but by the line of the arch that they form. Kublai Khan remains silent. Oh no! Reflecting, and then he adds, why do you speak to me of the stones? It's only the arch that matters to me. And Polo answers, well, without stones, there's no arch. And somehow this was meant to be the introduction to the stones, the work I've done in reading components across the years. They've become called reading components recently. And the arch, which is the technological activities that create learning, that have become the digital world in which literacy takes place and we read. And at that time, we were developing primitive, by today's standards, technology projects like PBS's Literacy Link, where we were building teacher professional development, learning activities at the GED and pre-GED level, and an assessment for practicing for the GED, which is the high school equivalency exam in the United States. As I said, I started with adults. By the way, so these are little charts that come from the first battery I ever built, which was called Sarah. At the time, it was not the Sabatini measure. It was the study of adult reading acquisition. Over the years, those letters have come to mean whatever I want them to mean. So, jumping ahead, by the way, the same component structure was then used to build reading components for the International Adult Literacy Study, which allowed us to look further down the bottom of the scale. I know there was a speaker I think I saw the week before talking about how PISA and PEARLS don't do a very good job of measuring at the bottom of the scale. But we do in PIAC. It actually fills in very nicely and gives you good results. Also at that time, I had the opportunity, I'm in the wrong direction, to work on fluency addition to the National Assessment of Adult Literacy back when we did this before PIAC in the United States. And so we took a battery of letters, digits, words, pseudo words, and third and eighth grade passages and had 23,000 adults, national sample, read aloud into a computer. Now this is in 2003. And then we had automated machine scoring of accuracy and rate with a group called Ordinate. And we were able to show, again, people at the bottom have a distribution of abilities on skills to acquire reading. Now, going back a step, I know why this was here. I was jumping ahead. These component measures later allow us to find what we call the decoding threshold hypothesis. That is, if you can't decode by fifth grade, well, then your reading comprehension doesn't grow at the same rate because you can't read the words off the page. And most of the schools in the US don't remediate that after fourth or fifth grade. And consequently, those students linger, drift on, and often have to leave school not being adequate readers. And so we discovered this in some of our large-scale studies as part of Reading for Understanding. Moving on, the 15 years after we did this with the adults, the NAEP decided to do a special study where they applied the same technology and methodology. And I kid you not, they used actually the same measures we developed for adults, modest adaptation, because we don't design things for kids or for adults. We design things that are for reading. And we used a better machine scoring, slightly better, but it's actually the same team who did the original scoring in 2003, Jared Bernstein and team. And again, we were able to show that there's a distribution of scores at the bottom end of the scale so that you can see a little bit more of what people can and can't do. I should note in PIAAC, one of the highlights was that many students who scored 0 on the main battery showed that they can read. Not quite as well, but they were on the scale. So they had skills. So I continued to do the reading components work with colleagues across time. And again, I'm kind of showing that in the beginning here, we developed them. 10 years later, they made it into PIAAC and even later into PISA in some form, and then into NAEP. So at the time, this early time, there were 2 societies that I was a member of and participating in. One of them was the Society for the Scientific Study of Reading, and they mostly focused on simple view, reading components, and so forth. Very little on comprehension. It was in the model, but nobody actually studied it. They just used whatever tests were there. And there's this other society called the Society for Text and Discourse that Art Gracers. What's the highest title you've received from Text and Discourse?
Some sort of lifetime achievement award.
There you go. Mm-hmm. But everybody there studied comprehension. And nobody there would study word recognition or decoding or anything else that went into it. And practically nobody went across either society. Maybe Chuck Perfetti was the only guy who actually went back and forth that I can recall. Okay, later Kate Kane and Jane Oakhill actually started to move in and out. So I thought, well, why don't we try to bring them together? I was now meeting all these wonderful psychometricians doing these advanced things. And again, the measurement here in these 2 societies was still what I would have called primitive relative to what I was seeing my colleagues doing in ETS. So let's bring them all together. I was already working on several projects for the Institute of Education Sciences, and Liz Albro was the program officer. So I went to IES. We asked for funding. They allowed us to put on this conference where we brought all these folks together, fed them often, let them sit together, drinks at night, and came up with what I thought was some really good stuff that we published in 2 different books that almost nobody reads because publisher wasn't that great. And this brings us to scenario-based assessment and reading for understanding. Because when the government, the IES, decided to put about $120 million into an initiative, they funded a set of teams, and I'll tell that story in a second. Anyway, so what we're going to do for the rest of the time, now that we're back to Star Wars 1, is we're going to work on this top part here. We're going to look at cognitive-based assessments for learning, CBAL and RFU, and mostly on scenario-based assessments. If we have some time or questions, we can look at the recent work as we're bringing it to scenario-based assessment 2.0 with AI to post-secondary education. So first I'll go to CBAL. So this starts around 2007. And as you see, it's called Cognitively-Based Assessment of, for, and as Learning. Wonderfully awful way to title for this, because every time we'd write something, we had to put of, for, and as in the title. So annoying, but maybe worth it. So the idea was most assessments were still built on like a blueprint model with behavioral background. And Randy Bennett and Drew Jitelmer at ETS thought we should be using cognition, cognitive science to do these. That was before the term learning science came into vogue. And so they started an R&D project that was supposed to last 10 years, and it did, spanning English language arts, math, and science. And the English language arts team, which I led for a while, along with colleagues Paul Dean and Naya O'Reilly, combined reading and writing. In fact, we started to build frameworks that actually put them back together since they had somehow gotten separated in the curriculum. And we actually had teachers at one point telling us, that they're not writing and reading are not as related as I believe they are. But we were going to use theory-based models and empirical research that would document what students have learned of learning, help identify how to plan instruction, which is formative for learning, and is considered by students and teachers to be worthwhile education experience in and of itself as learning. So we're going to model as best we can what good instruction might look like in the assessment if we can, so it becomes a guide for instruction. And that's what I'll talk to you mostly about, our attempts to do that and get your ideas afterwards about how we can do a better job at that. So back to the Reading for Understanding. So when they put this $120 million project together, Liz Albro is one of the people writing it. So they're writing a call, and what they do is they put this together. It's a 5-year mission to really put a network of research together and study this phenomenon of comprehension, because they felt that decoding was pretty well studied. I don't know if that was true, but that's what the goal was. So they funded these 5 teams to span at least 4 or 5 grade levels: pre-K through 3, pre-K through 4, Florida State. The group I had already been working with, SERP and Harvard, and then a group with Susan Goldman at 6 through 12 from Illinois, and a group from University of Texas, Sharon Blum. But they included an assessment team. So each of the other teams got $20 million. We got $15 million. I always complain because we had to do pre-K through 12. They only had to do 4 grades consecutively, but it was plenty of money. It was very nice. And our goal was to create a construct that's both theory-driven and sensitive to development across pre-K through 12, conduct research related to advanced reading theory, so what people were telling us was important to measure and what was good for instruction, and then develop new summative and formative assessments, and then evaluate the whole thing. So these are some of the people who participated. Recognize some folks there. So you get to reformulate how you describe these things. And so our way of talking about it was to say, we wanted to address a 21st century reading construct. We wanted to incorporate the reading and learning sciences into the designs. We wanted to enhance their instructional relevance. And we wanted to maintain the feasibility and psychometric quality. Now, this was really important to me because a lot of what we were doing was modeled in a way after the ahead of its time performance assessment movement in the 1990s. Great work done there, but they didn't have the technological infrastructure to really pull it off. And what happened in the literature is they were complaints about it wasn't feasible to administer, took too long, too much time. You had a lot of marking, I think you call it, scoring by teachers. There was a lot of time and effort, and it wasn't perfectly reliable and psychometrically sound after all that effort. So that were one of the only reasons, but that sort of dwindled back, and then multiple choice tests and essay writing became all there was for a long time. So I didn't want my colleagues at ETS, who are psychometricians, telling me this isn't going to work. We had to make sure at every step of the way we made decisions that made sure it would work. And later I'll show you that we feel like we did a pretty good job with that. Adequate. So what is this 21st century reading construct? Well, this is the way we've sort of encapsulated it in one way, in a kind of process model. You read for a purpose. You establish relevance and standards of coherence. That is, you have to decide what it is you're reading for based on all this text that you might have in front of you. Maybe multiple texts, whatever. You search for and integrate information, often across multiple texts. After all, the web is out there and you have sources here that you have to that contradict each other or build on each other. You evaluate the credibility of those sources. You allocate your attention to this complex purpose for reading and understanding or learning or doing something. And you're probably going to end up navigating the digital information and communication environments in which a lot of this information lives in the 21st century. Because after all, I don't even know the count anymore. Last time we had was 17 billion websites. I think that was in 2017. You can't just go at it and start reading. You have to know what you're doing to get there. So we put together a framework and we divided things differently than most people. I don't know that this has ever caught on, but eventually we got it published just recently with art in a British journal. And so we said print, but print, and I have a longer piece on this, but I'll do the short side. Print's not just decoding, right? It's the typography, it's the punctuation, it's the spaces, it's the visuals around what you're looking at, it's the whole screen of navigation you're dealing with. So print is a complicated visual array of information in a literate world. It always has been. First books had pictures and illustrations in them. So you've always had to do this kind of integration. So we wanted to make sure that that was, when people said print, they no longer meant just decoding, which by the way isn't all print anyway, it's print and sound. Language, and we wanted to make sure that was complete. So we taught everything from phonetics to pragmatics and classic linguistic sense. Everything about language is part of reading and part of the development of reading. Text and discourse, this is building the mental models of what the text says. Thinking consumption, once you get it in your head, you think about it. You analyze it, you summarize it, you do logical stuff. And then we separated out social modeling and perspective taking. I think I and Art Gracer probably had enough conversations or debates about this move, but we felt it's a difference of kind when you take your understanding of people, purposes, intentions in the world as part of your understanding of what it means to comprehend. That's different than analyzing, reasoning logic about it. And it's always in a comprehension test. It's from the earliest grade levels. They say, you can have pictures and this kid walking with an ice cream cone, up falls off, kid cries. And you're expected to interpret that. Well, you have to interpret that in terms of a social model and perspective taking. That's not a logical inference, that's a social inference. And so we were very intent on making sure that this idea that perspective taking, the point of view, not only of characters in fiction, but of a writer trying to convince you of things, or of a social context in which it's written. Like, for example, publishing in a journal, where a journal only accepts certain forms and genres of information. And so you fit to it. And now, POCO is performance moderators, where we talk about other factors that come from the learning sciences that influence reading and reading development, but don't show up in assessments, or at least not explicitly. Implicitly, they're there, some of them. Background knowledge. And my colleague, Tanea O'Reilly, has many publications, many citations about the interactions between comprehension and your knowledge. And we've been working that idea for a couple decades now. To some extent, engagement and motivation we built into the whole thing, as you can only read what you bother to read and what effort you put in. So we built those models in there. And then we thought that we could encourage and make sure metacognition was part of the process of understanding how you were reading, that you had to self-regulate yourself. I think the model we described earlier tells you about purpose, a goal, movement towards that goal, reflecting on whether you're getting there, reestablishing the plan of action to make sure you do. And of course, reading strategies, which have been one of the effective ways to help people become better readers. Turns out they can actually be embedded straight into a comprehension test, and you can get evidence of whether a person's a good reader at the same time using them. Summary, one of my favorites. Summary is, so eventually we get this published in, as I said, the British Journal. It was penned in a couple different tech reports in 2012, 13. So the core is all there. It's just this was the first time we got it into a journal. So what were we trying to do? Well, I was at ETS. I'd never say that multiple choice tests are evil. They're just not all there is. So they're effective at certain kinds of things. Certainly the rank ordering, certainly the scales are familiar. They've been a staple. But there have been critics along the way. They continue to be critics with sound points. But they continue to drive too often, too much, maybe more in the US, I don't know every world context, the curriculum, the outcomes, and therefore the instruction. And it's hard to get deep reading processes into a multiple choice test. Again, my colleagues at ETS can pull it off. Actually, some of these most of the scenario-based assessments work primarily on choice items. So we do try to pull it off, but and I lament the fact that we have now all these AI engines replicating this world, because the AI engines, large language models, can produce these ad nauseum with the same quality, except this isn't what I think we should be doing. And by the way, some of our research has moved in that direction as well. So mea culpa. And then yesterday, our research talked a little bit about writing and scoring writing. And again, there's pretty solid research that this is not the only way to represent student thinking. It's not a bad one, and it gets at deeper things. But it's one channel of expression of your thinking. And again, it's the one most under challenge because large language models allow students to basically cheat. And so now there's this sort of weird game going on between figuring out how, especially college professors, you can come up with alternate ways of assessing and having students do things without them simply using ChatGPT to do it for them. So finally, what is a scenario-based assessment? Well, again, we kind of go with simple. It's a technique that it's a series of techniques that represent a set of performance-based assessment models. Okay, so we're basically embedding all these things I talk about for performance-based, some project-based, simulation, portfolio, stealth. All of these are in some ways related to or empowered by a scenario-based assessment. The ones we've been building, we just say it's a way to deliver a set of sequenced and thematically interrelated content where students are given a larger purpose than simply answering the question in front of them. And then they're given a set of tasks that make sense for that purpose, that require them to integrate, synthesize, evaluate towards getting to that purpose. So we're engaging them in deeper thinking as best we can towards this purpose, modeling what it's like to use literacy materials to achieve your ends and goals. So now I'm going to spend the next chunk of time telling you a list of how we try to incorporate these elements into our designs. And to do so, we sort of compare it to traditional measures. So how long did you want me to go? Maybe another 15 minutes? Mm-hmm. So in a traditional, by the way, we named our measure GISA because we wanted to rhyme with PISA, so Global Integrated Scenario-Based Assessment. We were successful. It is used in PISA now. So we thought of PEARLS, but that gave us Global Integrated Reading Learning System Scenarios, which was GIRLS. And we just didn't think that was going to resonate as well. So GISA it was. So traditional, the purpose in a reading comprehension test, answer the questions correctly. That's it. Okay, in the time limit you're given. So that's the metacognitive part, by the way. The strategic ability to complete that test in the time limit with the cognitive effort you have for the highest score. That takes self-regulation. It's not in the construct definition. I've never seen it there, but that's kind of, I think, one of the factors that ends up making the scores meaningful. It's just not the right answers. It's the ability to take it. So we provide this larger goal. We help define what's important and relevant in it. There'll be characters helping you to do that. And so then you can plan your process. And we try to make it motivating and engaging. We thought we'd meet the students halfway. But traditional multiple choice test, about as low on the motivation scale as you can get. We tried to make these things at least interesting enough to want to stick with it. So here's an example of a larger purpose. Your team's created a wiki on world cultures, and one of the issues that's come up is who is the model for Da Vinci's Mona Lisa. And so you have to go through a set of materials to look at this history so that you can re-represent it in this wiki in a clear enough way for people to make sense of it. What's fun about this is we started with this one that's very compelling sounding. It seems very convincing. And then after you're done reading it, we say, by the way, this particular author lived 150 years after Da Vinci. It's not a contemporary at all. And then we bring you to a contemporary account of it. And then you have to sort of look at the contradictory information and figure out how you're going to represent it. Another thing we do is structure and sequence. So in traditional reading comprehension tests, there's item independence idea. So basically you have random passage, random question, random question, random question. Questions have nothing to do with each other. What happens next? Completely different passage, completely different set of questions, and so forth. Okay. And the innovation of computer adaptive testing is, repeat until standard error comes slow enough that we can stop. I mean, it's just not cognitive in the same way. And so we said, okay, the set of materials has to do with your purpose and your problem. You're not going to look at things that don't have relevance. And the other thing is we can deliver them in a certain order. As I just described this one, we can set you up with one passage and then bring something in that contradicts it or otherwise. And we have your cold response to each in a way. So we know what you were thinking and then what you're thinking and so forth. We can also build up understanding. That's one of the things we do as one way we approach background knowledge. We give you something that's foundational first so you know what we're talking about. And then we go into it more deeply after you've had a chance to look at that and study it and understand it. And finally, we can create these sequences. And I think that's what I have coming up next. So we like to start with a summary writing task. Later, I might show you why that's a good way to get students to really read the actual passage and understand it better. And so we have them write a short set of structured summaries. And one of the things we always do is we give you the guidelines. We don't make you guess what you have to do. We try very hard to tell you what exactly we expect, whether it's rubrics, whether it's guidelines. Okay, so in this case, they should be the main ideas, not the details, not your opinions or evaluative comments. That's what we mean by a summary. And it should be written in your own words. Don't just cut and paste from the original. Well, then after you do it, one of your peers, we have peers in here, writes this little bit of a summary. And you're asked, did they follow all of those guidelines? So we're asking you to find in there what might be wrong. And so you go through that. And then we go, I think they messed up on this one when they wrote this. Which one? And so you find which one they messed up on. And then finally, we come around to saying, how might you fix that? How might you help them to fix it? So we deconstruct the sequence of what you're supposed to understand and learn. And so from an assessment point of view, we've got your writing, and then we've got sort of confirmation, validation, whether you understood what you were doing, or we're diagnosing where you might have been uncertain, or whether you could understand at least the pieces, the stones, I guess, not just the arch. Background knowledge. We had a whole nother one. We've been playing with this one forever. It's not that it doesn't affect. I mean, the goal in a traditional test is, well, we'll sample all these different things. So you might know a lot about that, but nothing about that. That doesn't work at the individual level. It works at the group level, but at the individual level, I might know everything on this. I might know nothing on this. So how did you didn't solve the problem? You just masked it by not measuring it. So we felt strongly that, we should find out what you know. And so that's what we do. We actually have come up with techniques for quickly and I really love these things we do to measure using vocabulary knowledge, and facts and concepts, what you know already about the topic we're about to have you look at or read. And then later, sometimes we actually retest you to see the things that you didn't know, whether you learned them, because the passage is going to cover all those things, or the scenario will. So this is the technique that has been magic for us. So what we do is we use natural language processing. We do a topical analysis of the things we're doing. And then we get a list of words that are all by LSA or other techniques related to the topic. Not all those words necessarily appear in the passages, but they all are related to, say, in this case, farming or ecology or whatever. We then match these up with other words of equal frequency, but completely unrelated. And then we just make you sort. And we allow you the choice of, I don't know. And we tell you this doesn't count. So you're going to actually get the answers to this in a second. And we have several wonderful papers showing how strongly this is related to your actual score. And then we have how those students who use the I don't know effectively, metacognitively, we think, end up always getting higher scores relative to others kind of matched on this. And we think that's because they're aware of what they know and don't know, and use that to guide some of their thinking as they take the test. And we don't consider that a validity threat. Priming what you know is part of reading. So this is not an inappropriate thing to be doing first. And so forth. So we can do this for almost anything. And now we can do it pretty much instantly with large language models. I mean, so it's a lot easier than back in the day when we had to sort of really actually use these techniques. There's other techniques we use. We simply ask pictures. This was one on oysters in Chesapeake Bay. So we just said, which one of these is an oyster? We would do things like that. And in the current world, by the way, Nate uses actual videos, and we've used videos to introduce content. Now, video is its own kind of learning and challenge, but at least it builds up knowledge of what we think is important you'd be able to have available to you as you read and solve these problems. Okay, modeling strategies. So as the literature and the scientific literature tells us which strategies are effective instruction, we embed them. At the time, we had the ones you're looking at there were some of the ones we used: summary, graphic organizer. So for example, what we would do is we didn't have to teach you it. We would fill it out for you so you could follow the logic of it. And then we tell you it's a way of reorganizing the information, and then we'd have you fill in pieces of it. And you can think about, we could really vary this. We can fill in more, fill in less, make it harder, easier. We can build on this once you understand, taking a few scenarios, you start to get used to this idea. So it's a way of sort of getting at a deeper knowledge. We can have you drag and drop in there or write them. As I said, summary was one that we used quite often in that regard. And finally, I don't know if this is finally, it's not finally. As you saw, we actively use peers. Now, in the auto tutor world, the peer teacher trialogue is like one of the effective ways of getting learning to occur. In our scenarios, we kind of 1.0, they were fake. They didn't talk back to you, but they structured things in all these different ways. The teacher was your reliable source. Your peers could do things right, wrong. They could summarize things. They could model thinking about things. And so you were in a social setting, which is, again, in our modern thinking of the 21st century reading, it is social. It's not a solo act. Or it's not only a solo act. Reading is something that is shared, that is what you build knowledge, you share that knowledge, you talk about things. It's not a you and a book, not only you and a book. So here's one where we're moderating a blog like or a chat, and their goals are things like, well, what's going on here? Is this accurate to what you learned earlier? And if it's not, oops, I should go back. Another task we give them here is like, oh, this one said, is this what they said true or false based on what you just read? How might you nicely correct it or add to the discussion? Which ones are relevant, et cetera. So we use that social communication as a way of getting at what they've learned to read or do. As we got to the older grades, it became important. This was the Susan Goldman group. There was like, oh, the whole time we're doing this, these other 5 groups are building these interventions and instruction and using the theory, and we're paying attention. Our team had the mantra that every other team can use our assessments that we're building as their outcome measures or should want to. And we were successful because the teams that kind of built us in from the start, SERP, the Goldman team, found significant outcomes. Now, we didn't build to their interventions. We built around the constructs they were interested in. So, in fact, we got challenged once on what's called the What Works Clearinghouse, because we had built the assessments, and they said, well, that's not fair because they're yours. And I was able to demonstrate to them that, no, we were independent. We built the construct. We evaluated it with other students, and then we used it. And so they went, okay, Anyway, so we basically had the opportunity to build for science classrooms, for history classrooms, for language arts classrooms. And we took the same, one of the techniques we used a lot in high school was the study group. That's a good model. People work together to study for things. And so we had a study group around science, we had a study group, and each one has different things. So a study group around science is going to look at data, make inferences from it from the epistemological point of view of a scientist. In history, they look at primary and secondary sources and figure that out. And then in literature, they looked at stories like Thank You, Ma'am. This was drawn off of the NAEP and sort of literary themes and plots. So, summarize the reading for understanding time. And there are plenty of publications that have ensued since that I'm happy to share if any of these topics seem interesting or you just don't believe me. So we can back some of this up. Another one of these nice little charts where we show that we started developing them back in the early 2008, 2009. And what's coming up next shows you they are now, we're not responsible for the ones in Pearls, but we can't take credit for those, but they have scenario-like assessments in Pearls, especially in the, well, I'm not sure where. They're in PISA, they're in PIAC, they're now in NAEP. And CAPD is the place where you can get them commercially. They're the distributor that we're still working with in the United States. We were a productive group. We kept all of our assessments to about 45 minutes because we wanted to test them out in schools, and we knew they would have about, that's a class period. They're all computer web administered. Nearly all the scoring is automatic. Whenever we used constructed response, we actually used those that were machine scorable as much as possible so we could build models so that they would be scorable. We did 17 of the more forms of the components with all 6 components. Sorry, I didn't talk about all of those. It's another talk with morphology and other things. 38 Giza forms. Here's a quick, we built greeting cards, postcards to we thought were a fun way to get people to see what we were doing. Sorry, I dug these out and I thought I remember we went to a conference and we just handed them out to students, would you like to take a test that looks like that? We got a lot of data and anybody who's interested, anytime to mine it, it's now de-identified, it's in my possession. You ask me, we figure out a way to let you probe it. It's still relevant. I believe it's still relevant. So a little old, but it's not like a lot of people out there doing scenario-based assessments across the lifespan as we were. Because again, we had a follow-up project. Oh, it's coming. So this is just the Sarah Rise. We had this district. We had multiple waves per year, multiple grades. This is what allowed us to do the decoding threshold because we not only saw across grades people who couldn't decode, but then we could follow them for 2 or 3 years longitudinally to see that their comprehension growth was lower than those with higher scores. So we were able to do some nifty analyses. That's the scenario-based assessment data by group. And then we followed up, a lot of different follow-up spin-off studies and grants that allowed us to sort of probe for adults, for post-secondary, different populations and so forth. And this kind of just charts out the different places we had used it as of about 2017. This is all before I got to University of Memphis. I was weak, I'm sorry. I had to dig out older slides, so I didn't have time to update everything. And again, we did some real solid research, and this one shows, if you have, and this was just classic comprehension test style. So you have students, college students this was, read the passage, answer the multiple choice questions. Or you have a condition where you get the passage, write a brief summary, and then answer the multiple choice questions. This is about what it looks like if you simply give them the multiple choice questions. They look into the passage very lightly to find the answer. This is what it looks like if you ask them to write the summary first. And this, I didn't have it here. If every single one of them did this, every one of those things was block. Then what happens is, by the way, if once you do this and then you answer the multiple choice questions, it looks even less than that, because now they know exactly where the answer is. They built a mental model and it's quick and easy for them to do it. There's another study that shows an interaction by ability on this thing. And our argument was all about, shouldn't a reading comprehension test to be valid, shouldn't you have some evidence that they've actually read the passage? Because it turns out good readers don't really need to read the passage. There's no, I just saw a study that was like, well, they didn't build a coherent model. And I had to write back and review and say, I don't think they read the passage. There's no reason for them to build a coherent mental model. It's not going to help them perform. It's going to slow them down. So, they should be as efficient as possible during a test to get the best score. So, but this basically threw a monkey wrench in it and made them actually read the passage. So anyway, you can read all about it in this follow-up that we had nothing to do with. The National Academy of Science recruited some people like David Pearson, Penny Dow, and others to write up what they thought were the best outcomes from the whole initiative. And we get a nice chapter in there as well for assessment. So finally, and I know, I'm sorry, I ran a few minutes late, but just some messages that I like. These were told to, this is coming from the presentation made to sort of the board of directors of ETS, trying to convince them to actually use scenario-based assessments and other things that we were building. That the 21st century construct has changed, and that you can look at it by looking at purpose-driven, social, and perspective. These are some of the things that we found that we didn't think were in the tests that they were building so far. They're feasible and practical to build and to deploy. They're not more difficult. We did them all the way down to like K1, 2, 3. We did scenarios. People are like, well, no, you just have to design. You have to understand how to design. You make it for different populations. They're somewhat diagnostic. And since reading instruction is so uneven in the United States, there's a role for foundational skills to identify difficulties some students are having that may not be solely comprehension. Typically, it's usually this and comprehension, but it doesn't have to be. If you change the multimodal delivery, we might find that these students are kind of fine. So this is it, I thought this seemed still relevant. Reading's changed. How we teach it has to continue to change to the research. How we assess it has to change in relationship to that research. Otherwise, we're measuring the wrong thing. And the tools that we're using, the psychometrics, the delivery, all of those have to be continuously monitored to do the best we can with them, a la large language models and multimodal delivery. But we have to the whole world has to come along. It's really easy to criticize these large tests. Go and try to change them. And all of a sudden, that same state director who loved to complain, or that teacher, they have to relearn a whole new system. They're not happy about that. It's easier to complain sometimes than it is to learn and change to something new. And the trustworthiness of these, even though we can show them the evidence, isn't transparent why this is better or different and what you should do. So we all have to be sort of in the game of making sure that we're communicating in each step with all the stakeholders to try to bring them along into these ideas if we think they're valuable. So, oops. Oh no, I ruined it. There it is. Wait for it. Thank you.